Right. Shabbat Shalom and good morning and welcome. This is Valley Beth Shalom live and online. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this morning, as always, by my dear friends and teachers, Rabbi Sherry Hirsch of the American University and Rabbi Mark Gelman of the World. Today, coming to us live from Aspen, Colorado, which is just about as close to heaven as you can get and still breathe oxygen. So good morning, Mark. Good morning, Sherry. Good to have both of you with us. This morning, we're going to finish the last two parshiot, they're grouped together, of the book of Bamidbar. And in the story of the Torah, we're going to arrive at the boundaries of Eretz Canaan, ready to enter the land of Canaan. And we're going to listen to the very last episodes that take place before Moses' closing speech, which is his long, long orations in the book of Deuteronomy. But something else happens in the course of the Jewish week, Jewish year, this coming week. This coming week, we will celebrate or commemorate the beginning of the Hebrew month of Av. Now, the month of Av comes midsummer time, and the month of Av leads up to a day called Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th day of Av. The 9th day of Av is the day on which the entire Jewish people gather to commemorate the moments of tragedy and catastrophe that have attended us during the course of our history. 9th day of Av is a day when the first temple is said to have been destroyed in 586 BCE at the hands of the Babylonians, the second temple at the hands of the Romans, the expulsions from all of the lands of Europe, from Spain, from England, from France. It's the day of the massacres of York and other places. It's become a sort of day on which all of the tragedy of Jewish life is collected into one. And one day becomes a memorial day and a commemoration day and a day of great reflection and repentance. The custom among many religious Jews is that from the 9th day of Av, through the Tisha, from the first day of Av, that's this coming week, through the 9th day of Av, people refrain from eating meat. They refrain from having celebrations of happy occasions. Some even do that from Shvat B'Tammuz, from the 17th day of Tammuz, making it a 3-week time of commemoration. And so you sort of ingather all of the pain, the persecution, the oppression, and the exile of the Jewish people. Now, the holiday of 9th day of Av is still commemorated in traditional Jewish circles. It has become a little more controversial for two reasons. One is because the return to the land of Israel and the rebirth of the state of Israel raises the question about whether it is still a holiday that should be celebrated, or whether our return to Israel, our settlement in our homeland, the return to Jerusalem, our settlement there, has obviated the need to remember that we are an exiled people. Has the redemption of Israel, as it were, overcome, canceled out the sadness of Tisha B'Av? The other interesting reason why this holiday has come into some question has to do with a different kind of way of perspective, a different perspective, the notion of the Holocaust. The notion that the Holocaust blows apart the theology of Tisha B'Av. Now, the theology of Tisha B'Av is presented to us in a series of biblical and rabbinic texts. And we'll take a moment to look at them, and then I'll ask my colleagues for their reflections on this. So you look at the book of Leviticus. This is God's or Moses' warning to the people Israel before their entry into the land. Do not defile yourself in any of these ways, the ways of the nations, for it is by such that the nations I'm casting out before you defile themselves. Thus the land became defiled, and I called it to account for its iniquity, and the land spewed out its inhabitants. I mean, the image here is, excuse me, the image here is something that would be welcome in any good science fiction movie. The land of Israel is morally sensitive, and the land of Israel senses the behavior of the people who live upon it, and the land becomes offended by the immorality of its people. And when that immorality reaches a certain threshold, the land itself throws you out. But you must keep my laws and my rules, says God. You must not do any of the abhorrent things, neither citizen nor stranger, for these abhorrent things were done by the people who were in the land before you, and the land became defiled, so let not the land spew you out. The literal word in Hebrew is to vomit you out, as it vomited out the nations who came before you. And this is the basis, of course, of the prophetic warning to the people Israel. Here's the basis of Jeremiah, who lived in the generation of the destruction. And he says to the people Israel, I brought you to the country of a fertile land to enjoy its fruit and bounty, but you came and defiled my land, and you made my possession abhorrent. For my people have done twofold thing. They've forsaken me, the fount of living water, and hewed out cisterns that cannot hold water. You've defiled God's land and defied God. And for that reason, in the 7th chapter, which is Jeremiah's famous temple sermon, he says to the people, you're going to be destroyed. And you're going to be destroyed just like the people who lived in the north are going to be destroyed. And here's where it becomes most remarkable. You're going to be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, who is the rod of God's wrath. So here is the controversial question having to do with Shoah. Is there in any way to construct a theology which imagines that we were punished in the Holocaust and that somehow the Nazis were the rod of God's wrath punishing us for some sin? It's for that reason, it's because that reason is so difficult to accept, because that to imagine that in some way the brutality, the cruelty, the horror of the Nazis is in some way divinely ordained, that one of the great theologians of this century, Rabbi Gelman's teacher, Rabbi Richard Rubinstein, said that theology has to be put aside. We can no longer accept that theology. And if we can no longer accept that theology, it calls into question a great deal of Jewish thought, Jewish theology, thinking about God. Because it's very difficult to think about a God of history once we push that theology aside. So comes Tisha, comes the first day of Av this next week, and then the following week we'll have Tisha B'Av. Let's talk a little bit about these themes. Do we find ourselves in a history controlled by a God of history who punishes us? Is suffering a form of punishment? And the second set of questions has to do with how the Jewish people overcame these catastrophes and found hope and the will to go on living following these catastrophes. What's the answer to Tisha B'Av? Let me welcome my dear friends, Rabbi Hirsch and Rabbi Gelman. Who'd like to begin this morning?
Oh, Rabbi Gelman, I always defer to you first.
Oh, you're so sweet. Look, I think we have to leapfrog backwards to Aristotle and look at the nature of evil. And according to Aristotle, there's two kinds of evil. There's natural evil and moral evil. Natural evil is like an earthquake or a tsunami. Now, of course, in the Torah, we see natural evil is also brought into this idea of punishment. Moral evil is when you sin and you're punished for your sins. So the question about the Holocaust and the point at which I argued with my teacher, my beloved teacher, Richard Rubinstein, was that I think he overlooked that distinction. Namely, that the Holocaust is a punishment. It's not a punishment for Jews, although we were the victims, primary victims. It's a punishment for all humanity. And it is a punishment for the sin of allowing fascism to rise in Europe unopposed. To let fascism rise unopposed from 1933, the Wannsee Conference was 1942. To let it get ahead of steam, to let evil take root on that level is the sin of the civilized world. And we know that from America Firsters and people who wanted Hitler and Stalin to kill each other and bleed each other to death, and who didn't want America involved in foreign wars and foreign entanglements. Sounds very similar to the present moment. And as a result of that, fascism rose, the Holocaust occurred, and we were all punished for it. And that, I think, is a legitimate point of view. What is not a legitimate point of view, in my opinion, is to blame God for betraying us by not saving us from the Holocaust. That is not legitimate, because there is no part of Judaism I know, none I teach, none I have ever heard of, that promises that God will save us from all evils. God doesn't promise to save us from evil. God promises to accompany us through evil, through the path, through the valley of the shadow of death, and to help us lo irara, that we shouldn't fear evil. God doesn't promise to protect us like Superman. And if God did, if that was the promise, then we would all be atheists the first time something happened to us that we found to be unacceptably evil. The first time a loved one died, the first time someone betrayed us. And we would say, God, why didn't you protect me from that? This idea, and I really am serious about this, I don't know where this idea took root. I know that it's had eloquent expressions in the Midrash JB by Archibald MacLeish. Zus, one of the characters, says to, Nichols says to Zus, who's God, says, if God is great, he is not good. If God is good, he is not God. Take the even, take the odd. I would not stand here if I could. So somewhere along the line, we have this idea that an all-powerful, all-good God has a responsibility to protect us from all evil. But the fact is that God has given us freedom of will. God has given us the ability to choose silence in the face of evil, to choose silence in the face of fascism, and to reap the horrid consequences of our silence. That's what God promises. And that promise was not betrayed in the Holocaust. That promise was not violated then. God, I say this as clearly as I can, in my opinion and in my faith and in my Judaism, God is not on the hook for the Holocaust.
So tell me something about celebrating Tisha B'Av. Does it have any meaning to a modern Jew who has a hard time seeing God in history the way our ancestors did?
Yes, I think it does. It's the death of sacred space. Sherry and I were talking during the week about sacred space and how we don't really have a sense of how powerful and important sacred space is. You ask people, what does the temple mean to you today? They go, what are you talking about, the temple? The temple in Jerusalem? It's a bunch of rocks and people are davening in front of the rocks. There's nothing. And the Tisha B'Av was the destruction of our center in space. And it left us only with sacred time. It left us as a religion which Heinrich Heine called a portable fatherland in the Torah and Talmud, portable. And that was the catastrophe. And that's what means something today, because the reimagining and the reestablishment of Jewish life and roots and power in the state of Israel has revived our sense of sacred space. And it's revived our sense that we have roots in a particular place. That's a significance to me.
Sherry, do you think that Tisha B'Av has any meaning for us now? And if it does, how do we understand it and how do we refigure its theology to account for the experiences of the 20th century?
So I wanted to respond to first, Mark, when you said that our community sinned by letting fascism take hold. That is a powerful image of a world sinning. That being said, the punishment was not appropriate to that sin, right? That it selectively categorized certain people and exterminated them at a mass extinction, potential mass extinction level, to me is not equivalent. You know, as a parent, you always say, does the punishment fit the crime? And you have to make sure that it is an appropriate. And to me, that sin and that punishment do not go together. So when you ask me, Rabbi Feinstein, Tisha B'Av philosophy, that we sinned and therefore we were punished, I cannot viscerally subscribe to that forget as a rabbi, but as a human. And I know when I sit with people, and just this week I sat with a survivor who lost her husband. If I even broached that, if I even said to her, there was some cause for this, she would have spit in my face. I mean, we are not punished. And if we believe that God is punishing us for these sins, we got to get a different God. And so that idea of Tisha B'Av being the place where we are, that philosophy, that theology, that being said, I think we can re-envision Tisha B'Av as a day of memory and of darkness, and a day that we remember how we survived despite all the darkness in our lives. That I can wrap my head around. And I think that's where Holocaust and Shoah, like the Shoah, has a place within the memory of Tisha B'Av.
Well, as Oscar Wilde said, Madam, you haven't had the pleasure of understanding me. I'm not saying God punished us in the Holocaust, Sherry. I don't believe God did punish us. That's exactly my point. I believe that we suffered as a world community, and most particularly as a Jewish community, because of our silence in the face of rising fascism. And if you say, well, it's not an appropriate punishment for letting fascism rise unopposed, I don't know who makes this judgment about what's appropriate and what isn't. Fascism destroyed the culture of Europe, and it destroyed our people. And our silence in the face of it, the Churchill's desperate and failed attempts to get the United States to get into the war earlier than they did, all of those are clear examples of how we used our freedom of choice, our freedom of the will, which God gave to us, so that we could establish a world that comes to God, but also so that we could create a world that flees from God and from God's commandments, which is what happened during World War II. And that's what happens when you allow evil to take root. There's no limit to how bad it can be. No limit.
Sure, you wanted to answer him?
No, I didn't misunderstand you, Rabbi Gilman. What I was saying is that there's so much to unpack there, but I don't believe we were silent. Yes, the American community did not take action in a way that it needed to, but we were trying, but fascism had taken hold. I mean, to me, it's like, we can debate that all day long, but it's like the fact that the Jews were going to be exterminated as a result of our staying silent. Where was God in that? You know, if we go ahead, Rabbi.
It's hard to find justice in this. That's what you're trying to say. It's hard to find. Mark, is there a difference? And let's not get into this now, but I mean, I think that what Sherry's pointing to, there's a difference between a sort of causal, historical, social relationship between facts and a moral relationship between facts.
Right.
Go ahead.
And it's like the way you speak about it, Mark, is like a political theorist. Correct. Right. But there's like a moral, visceral thing. You have to look people in the eye. You know, there's something very visceral about this. You can't wrap your head around it. And where was God in that? It's a complicated one.
I want to divert attention for a moment, but back to the rabbinic tradition for a moment, because what you find in the rabbinic tradition and in the teachings of the Talmud is a series of statements looking back at the destruction. Remember, the rabbis are looking back at the first temple's destruction, which was some 500-600 years before their lives, and looking back at the second temple's destruction, which was in their experience, which was in their collective memory. And what they're doing is they'll look back at it, even a couple of hundred years later, they'll look back at it and they're going to ask questions. And the question isn't so much, why did it happen? The question is, what can we learn from it? What can we, in what way do we need to do tshuva? And what kind of learning, what kind of growing can we draw out of a catastrophe? So the most famous text is this one in Talmud Yoma. The first temple was destroyed because of the sins of idolatry, sexual indecency, and murder. The second temple, in spite of the widespread study of Torah and the performance of commandments and deeds of compassion during its existence, fell because of sinat chinam, Now, sinat chinam means internecine internal rivalries, boundless hatred for one another, uncontrolled, rampant hatred. Causeless or boundless hatred is a sin that weighs as heavily as idolatry, sexual indecency, and murder. Now, it's an interesting statement. You can see what they're doing here. They're constructing history. This is certainly not an objective history, because we know that the Second Temple period wasn't the time of widespread study of Torah and performance of good deeds and deeds of compassion. And if it was, there wouldn't have been sinat chinam. But what they're trying to do is they're actually using the experience of catastrophe as a kind of magnifying glass to look at their own moment in history and say, if destruction came to us, did it come to us because of any of the traits that still live among us? And the trait, the interesting thing that the rabbis identify in this particular text, is the capacity of the Jewish community, no matter how threatened that community might be by outside threats, to turn on each other. To turn on each other, which we certainly see. And the rabbis were so worried about the fragility of social solidarity within Jewish community life that they said, if you want to know the one thing that brought the whole temple crashing down, this is what it was. This is what it was. And then in the next set of texts, in Talmud Shabbos and Talmud Chagiga, they go through a sort of catalog. And once again, these aren't historical reasons. There's no historicity to this. But what they're using it as a tool to bring us to a sort of tshuva. You know, so why was Jerusalem destroyed? And you'll see each one of these things is something that was the problem in that generation. It's people profane the Shabbos. Okay, another rabbi says they neglected to recite their prayers in the daily Shema. Another one says they stopped teaching Torah to their children. They lost their sense of shame. That's a very interesting one.
That's the best one of all.
You like that one. They paid no respect to those who deserve reverence. Rav Amram quoted his father, they did not admonish one another. That means, to correct one another, and turned their faces away and saw no evil. They held scholars in contempt. There were no trustworthy persons in Jerusalem. And then the last one from Rabbi Yochanan, and he's an extraordinary character in rabbinic literature. They insisted on the exact fulfillment of the letter of the law and never sought equity. In other words, a sort of pedantic observance of law came over the community, and there was no room for compassion within the practice of religion, which is a remarkable one. And the image that the Midrash gives us in this next text, and then we'll come back to the question at hand, is a powerful image. When the temple was set afire, the chief priests who were in the temple took their keys in their hands and hurled them skyward to the Holy One, to God, saying, Lord of the universe, here are your keys that you entrusted us, since we have not been faithful custodians to carry out the duties set by the king. We are no longer worthy to eat at the king's table. And the keys are in heaven. And we're still waiting for God to return the keys to us to bring it back. It's a profound image. We abused the intimacy that we had with God. We didn't protect with a sufficient reverence the capacity to bring God in the world. We destroyed the house that God lived among us. And therefore, God, move out of the neighborhood. It's the only thing you can do. Here are the keys. Take them back. It's just a profound image.
Yes,
now,
it is.
what they're doing here is, go ahead, Mark.
For both of you, because I'm always I'm the victim of the question. And I want to ask this question because it's one that troubles me deep in my heart. Because I observe Tisha B'Av, but I don't have my heart in it for the first reason I told you, that I don't think God's on the hook. But the second is, I don't want the temple back. I'm not really mourning the fact that the temple's gone. And my question to you is, are you mourning the fact that we don't sacrifice animals and we don't have an inherited priesthood? Is that something you want back in Judaism? Is that something you mourn for? Because I don't mourn for it for 1 second. And I don't think the rabbis did either. They were happy, not happy at the death and misery, but they were happy that Judaism had moved on from an inherited priesthood, which was phenomenally corrupt, to a meritocracy of rabbis that was filled with geniuses that reconstructed Judaism. It was an animal sacrifice versus prayer. Everything the rabbis did improved Judaism. And I don't want the temple back. And I wonder, is there anything in you, in your faith, in your Judaism, that mourns for the existence of the temple in Jerusalem?
Sherry, want a temple back?
I don't want a temple back. No, I'm not a big fan of bringing back the temple, especially not the sacrifices, or as Rabbi Feinstein, you say, the barbecue sacrifice. And I'm not interested in that, but I do have profound meaning in Tisha B'Av as a day when we reflect on the sadness that we've gone through as a community for years and years and years. That's been at the hands of other people, that things that we've built have been destroyed, and things that we've created and ideas and souls have been devastated and exterminated. And to me, that's a very powerful holiday. I'll just share that 2 years ago, I was in Poland, and it was the first time I went to the camps. And as I was walking through Auschwitz and looking at the floor, like I had this real visceral feeling of not Yom HaShoah, but Tisha B'Av, like sitting on the floor, having nothing, being starving and freezing, and all these experiences. So I tremendously grieve on that day. It's a loss of what could be. I think of, if the 6 million Jews were not exterminated, what the Jewish people's just numbers would be now, right? It would be exponentially different in the world. So Tisha B'Av has a lot of resonance for me, but I don't take it so literally that it's just that temple that I want back, nor those barbecues.
I would put it this way. There's a fundamental difference between memory and history. Memory is what you remember happened, and memory can fail, or it can distort. History is something very different. History is the story we choose to tell, and history is always constructed. It's always constructed. In that sense, there's something political about the process of history, because it's constructed based on the values that you hold and the purposes to which you would put history. So the Jewish people constructed a history, and the history that we constructed was a history that served a purpose. And the purpose was to help us to survive a very precarious political position in the world. And not just a political position, but a psychological condition. After all, from the middle of the Bible, we face a tremendous problem of cognitive dissonance. And we still do, by the way. We call ourselves a chosen people. We talk about an intimacy that we have with the God of the universe. And yet we're a pretty powerless, peripheral people in the world. Now, we Jews, in order to survive that cognitive dissonance between our sense of ourselves and the realistic picture of who we and what we are in the world, we've constructed a history. Part of it's neurotic. We put ourselves at the center of the world and blame everything on ourselves. But part of it is actually a way of sort of reconciling that by saying that the event, we can learn from the events of our history. So what we do is we create a mythical past. And the mythical past, the temple that we want to rebuild, or that we say we want to rebuild, it's not a real place. It's a fantasy of the solidarity of the community, the safety and security of the community, and a sense of spiritual intimacy with one another and with God. Moses Maimonides, in his wonderful in the Mishnah Torah, says that, when the Messiah will come, don't expect lions to lie down with lambs. That's not going to happen. That's a metaphor. He says the only thing that's going to change is that the Jewish people will find sovereignty in their own land. So what Maimonides is saying, the same thing. I don't want to rebuild a temple. I don't want animal sacrifices. Maimonides said this in the 12th century. I don't want that. That's a form of worship that was appropriate for a moment in our history, but not appropriate now. But what I do want is for the Jewish people to have the opportunity to live in safety in the world, to construct a society in which the public space reflects the values of this tradition, and that there is a sense of solidarity among the Jewish people, that we can come back together, put aside many of our differences, the sinat chinam that the Talmud talked about, and make common cause with one another and protect one another. So that's when I mourn Tisha B'Av, that's what I mourn. I mourn the intimacy, the common cause, the solidarity, the common understanding. But for me, Tisha B'Av is a very constructive, not a destructive holiday. Because for me, the flip side of Tisha B'Av, and forgive me for being a Zionist in this, the flip side of Tisha B'Av is, how did we survive? The miracle isn't, the tragedy is the temple was destroyed and we were dispersed and we were exiled again and again and again. But how did we survive? How does a people survive that? Why are we still here? So if you're if you're theologically minded, you say it's because God still needs us in the world. God has purposes for us. I think a very good book, by the way, Tisha B'Av's coming. So let me recommend a really wonderful book to read on that very topic. The wonderful historian Simon Schama, professor of history at Columbia, is a Jewish fellow from Sephardic background, raised in Great Britain, educated, of course, in the great university. He's a professor and a scholar of European history, actually French history, and writes a lot about art, French Renaissance art. Schama made a promise to his teacher Cecil Roth that he would write a book on Jewish history, and he's written 2 of the 3 volumes called The Story of the Jews. It's brilliant. First of all, it's really readable. It's fun to read. And second of all, you get a sense, and what he captures in this book in such beautiful narrative is the capacity of this people to thrive under the worst of conditions. The deep inner resilience of the Jewish people. I celebrate that on Tisha B'Av. That's my great celebration. Now, let me ask you, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, and there's a lot to be learned from that in this moment, to tap into that resilience and to use those skills that are literally in our blood to get through these moments that are challenging and in their own way and difficult and have obstacles. So I think there's a lot to be learned. I have to say, Rabbi Feinstein, every time I say, this is a book you'll love, it's a Jewish book, people are like, you're a rabbi. But I really do decipher it, and I know you do too. So I'm going to say that Shama's book is fantastic. I know.
Well, I like your holiday. It's not Tisha B'Av, but I like it. It has nothing to do with Tisha B'Av, which is, to my simple mind, I'm a simple man, a simple Jew, just a simple Jew, that this is a holiday mourning the destruction of the temple, not the metaphorical temple, not the unity and strength of the Jewish people. We're all in favor of that. It's an institution that was inherited. The power was inherited, which is essentially corrupt. The Hasmoneans and the other priests were phenomenally corrupt. It involved sacrificing animals, which is cruel suffering for innocent animals, and it was a place that took every effort they had to destroy the Pharisees and the rabbis and the movement that we are the beneficiaries of. This wasn't just another place. This was the enemy. These were the people who were opposed to the rabbis. These were the people who turned them into the Romans. These were the people who are responsible for the death of the greatest rabbis. I don't mourn their absence for this much. And if I
You're
could,
such a literalist, Mark.
not a literalist. It says, what is Tisha B'Av in my Junior Jewish Encyclopedia, which is how I learn everything in life, the Junior Jewish Encyclopedia. Tisha B'Av celebrates the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. I'm sorry, I'm out. I'm glad it's gone. And if it was back, I'm not going to be part of a priesthood. I'm not going to honor the priesthood. I'm not going to sacrifice animals. Barbecue, I'm neutral on. That's another matter. However, I don't know. I think it's time for us to really move on beyond holidays that celebrate institutions we never wanted, suffered from, and don't want back.
Yes, but you see, again, it's a question of history, not memory.
Yeah.
memory is what was there. History is what we construct to be there. I don't know how many of I've had the experience of going back and seeing the house I was in as a little kid. I was born in New Jersey and we moved to California when I was 6. And when I was a teenager, we took a family trip back east and my folks took us to the house. And I remember the house in a certain way, in a certain neighborhood, with a certain warmth and fuzziness. And when I saw it, I said, oh my God, that's the house. All of us, we reconstruct our memories. The first apartment you lived in was a crappy little place, except you were crazy in love with each other, and that's what you remember. We remember the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, not as it was. We remember it as we wanted it to be, as it should have been, as it should have been. And
And
that's what we're remembering, and that's what we're memorializing. Sherry, go ahead.
it's necessary to reframe our memory so that we have hope and so that we can go forward. I mean, there's so much neuroscience around that the retelling of our stories deeply affects our sense of hope, faith, and belief in the world. When we retell it in a negative way versus if we tell it in a hopeful way, and that restructuring, that retelling, we romanticize that first apartment, even though it was terrible.
So let me
Right?
ask you the question now, and this is the closing question for this morning, because Tisha B'Av's coming and we're living in a world of upheaval. We're living in a world of a spiking virus, which is continuing to push us apart. We're living in a world of economic catastrophe. We're living in a world of a certain degree of political insecurity and just a sense of tension, a lot of tension in the world. So Sherry, what does Tisha B'Av teach for this moment? What does the commemoration of Jewish catastrophe teach us for this moment as we're dealing with the catastrophes around us?
It's a very subtle, obvious message that you've stated so beautifully, Eddie, which is we continue to thrive despite the most challenging of circumstances. And even if we think that this is impossible to get through, with resilience, with connection, with Judaism, with text, with every aspect of our being and our tradition, we will not just survive, but we will thrive. And for me, that's a day to celebrate and to recognize and to remember.
Mark, what do we remember? What do we gather from Tisha B'Av that gives us something at this moment of our experience?
Okay, for me, this is like being a member of the American South and having an ambivalent relationship with the Confederacy. They say, well, but it's our memory of a warm and beautiful time in our past. Oh yeah, we had slaves. Oh yeah. But we have warm memory, and that's the history we construct. And you shouldn't take that away from us. No, I'm sorry. The legacy for Tisha B'Av, the legacy for the present moment, for those who worship the Confederate flag, is sometimes society advances. Sometimes what you think of as the good old days were just the old days, and they weren't the good old days. They weren't days that were good. They weren't days that were free. They weren't days that lifted up intelligence and study and gave it to people who were able to lead the community, but rather they were a time of misogyny, a time of inherited power, and we're well rid of it. We're well rid of it, and it's good that we can say about our faith, even catastrophes like the destruction of the temple, like the burning of a forest. They provide new light for new seeds that couldn't grow in the old forest because the trees shaded them and kept them from the light. No, we are in the light now. We are more in the light now after the destruction of the temple because Rabbinic Judaism was allowed to thrive and grow and live and improve the theological sophistication and hope and meaning and joy and love that is in Judaism now. For me, Tisha B'Av is a way of saying, don't mourn the past. Understand that your job is to move forward and bring the light.
Good lessons. Wonderful. Thank you both.
Okay.
I would only add one piece, which I think is germane, which is I like what the rabbis did. I've come to understand it much deeper as I've gotten older in my life. When I was a kid, I looked at those same texts and I said, but that's not historical. But now I understand what they were really trying to do. If you're living in catastrophic times, so you look back at previous catastrophes and you ask yourself, what can I learn? And what you're doing is using the previous catastrophe as a simple magnifying glass to understand the catastrophe you're living in. And I would point to just one of those texts, the very first one, which pins the destruction of Jerusalem on sinat chinam, on the endless capacity to turn to the other as an antagonist, as an opponent, and to push away the other. And that was the thing that destroyed the temple. That's what it was that banished God from the world. That's what it was that destroyed the intimacy among the people and the intimacy that we had with the divine. And I feel it. I don't know whether you've been to the supermarket recently, but people wear masks, people don't wear masks, and there's such antagonism that there's a sense of antagonism. I think we're all getting stir crazy, stuck in our homes. I think that we're all tired of this. I think we were really hoping that there would be a diminution of the catastrophe and we'd be able to start slowly moving back to normality. And now that we've been pushed back inside, when you take away hope from people, it really hurts. And there's a compensatory sort of unloading of rage, and we unload it on each other. The authorities are telling us that domestic violence has gone through the roof as people have gotten stuck with each other, and there doesn't seem to be an end to this, and I worry about that. So that the rabbinic tradition comes along and gives us this wonderful day to say, okay, as Sherry said, we have the capacity to find resilience even in moments of difficulty, and as Mark said, we have to understand that we're in a new moment and move past our history. And I would just add that one piece, that sinat chinam is still that unrivaled antagonism, oppositionalism, rage is still the huge human problem. And the answer is what it always was. Rav Kook answered that text by saying, if the temple was destroyed through sinat chinam, it will be restored through ahavat chinam, boundless, unreasonable, unjustified kindness and love. And that we have to find that within him once again. I want to thank my dear friends and teachers for joining me this morning for Shabbos Torah study. I want to thank all of you. Please take good care of yourselves and have a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos and a wonderful, wonderful week. Torah davening follows this, of course, this morning, and then at 11:30, Rabbi Silverman will be offering his thoughts on the weekly Torah portion. Havdalah tonight at 8:30, and look for us online. 8:30 Sunday morning, 7:30 weekday mornings, and 6 o'clock each evening for Minyan. Rabbi Hoffman is teaching his prayer dynamics class on Thursday night. I'm going to be leaving a little vacation this week, and we'll be back during August. Torah study will continue, by the way, because Torah never stops. But all of the classes and offerings of Valley Beth Shalom will continue. And Sherry would like me to offer you the fact that the AJU's Biyachad program offers multiple opportunities to learn and take advantage of them. This is one of the great moments in Jewish history, by the way. We've lost our physical proximity, but we've gained access to enormous wealth of learning and wisdom. And AJU, Valley Beth Shalom, and so many other institutions have made that possible. Have a good Shabbos.